Welcome to another Founder Wisdom Pod. We have Zach Bitter with us today. Zach is a completely beast. Yeah, when it comes to ultra marathons, he is the world record holder of the 100 mile on track and 12-hour run on track. So had a couple of ultra marathon runners as of late, but yeah, Zach seems to be the goat here. He accomplished a whole bunch of crazy feats. 100 mile in 11 hours and 19 minutes, which is pretty insane. That was in 2002. And yeah, definitely an OG in the ultra marathon field. So, Zach, welcome to the pod. Glad to have you on. Tell me a bit more about yourself and yeah, what you're up to nowadays.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Charles. It's gonna be fun to chat. So, yeah, I'm kind of still grinding away on the training for ultra marathons and things like that. I've been training for those since essentially 2010 at this point. So, it's been kind of a fun journey. Um, I've been focusing a lot on kind of runnable hundreds, and I kind of am continuing to do that. But I'm getting really interested in kind of some of the multi-day aspects of ultra marathon too, because the history of the sport actually dates back into like the 1700s where they would call it pedestrianism back then, but they would do like these really enormous events. And even in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they'd fill Madison Square Garden with spectators to watch these 6 day events. They would bet on them and like all sorts of different craziness that went into all of that stuff. So just kind of trying to continue to learn about the history of the sport, all the different inputs, because it is a pretty wide variety of stuff, and then kind of focus my interest in training and racing into what the kind of drives that passion for that. So that's usually how I kind of pick an event to train for. Other than that, it's been kind of fun to just stay on top of other things that are exciting to me, like podcasting and coaching and working with people to try to better themselves through running or fitness and that sort of stuff too. So I always enjoy my time with my coaching clients, getting to problem solve and kind of live vicariously through them to some degree when they're out there crushing it on their race courses and things like that.
Love it. And tell me about the first official ultra marathoner. Like, was that marathon in Athens? Like, why did humans actually ran such long distances back then when it was hard enough to survive, even not running?
Yeah, that's actually another interesting topic that I've been doing a little bit of on the podcast is looking at some of these ancient endurance practices where, the act of running and then specifically ultra marathon running used to be a necessity versus a hobby or a passion project. So, um, yeah, it's really interesting when you kind of look back at the different things that people did and the different stories around just these long distance traveling, different tribes that have a lot of documentation of different routes and things that they would take for various purposes and jumping in and all that stuff. So I guess we probably don't actually know the first ultra marathon or who invented the sport. I mean, it was probably dates back further than we have a record of. So to some degree, it's kind of always been there. But from a organized standpoint, I think if I remember right, you go back to like some of these early pedestrian events where it kind of got like a little bit of a short loop vibe to it where you'd oftentimes have these like challenges or bets and people would just see like how many times they could go around like a certain like block or something like that, and there would oftentimes be like a bar or something in the area. So like people would be kind of hanging out and congregating there and watching these people go around and things like that. And a lot of that kind of gained popularity in the UK. And then that kind of spread over to the United States. And this is more, I guess this would be technically kind of the more modern ultra marathon running because there was a structure behind it versus it being sort of a vehicle of necessity as I was kind of describing before. Um, but yeah, just kind of it grew in popularity. It faded a bit in like the 1920s, and that was sort of multifactorial. One was the invention of the bicycle, started kind of pulling away from some of the focus on the running side of things, and bike racing got a little bit more popular and started growing. And then there was also some other kind of tangibles that just fed into it being something that kind of faded out, like some rules and regulations came down that made it very difficult to even legally put on a 6 day event. And the 6 day event was like the big one. That was the spotlight event back then. So they kind of took the biggest. It'd be like taking the Super Bowl away from the NFL. It's like, okay, we just end here with two NFC and AFC championship games. And it loses a little bit of his luster at that point. Um, so then it kind of faded a bit. And then it really started growing again in popularity in around the kind of the early 2010 range. You had like the trail side of the sport, which is actually relatively new to a large degree relative to some of the more kind of structured timed event type things that I was just describing. But that really has grown in the last 10, 15 years now, where the trail side of the sport is actually the more popular side of ultra marathon running, where these events like the Western States 100 or UTMB, which is just over 100 miles, have gotten to be like these kind of fixture events where a lot of the top talent on the trail side will go to those events to compete and race for a chance to kind of showcase their skills, I guess.
Right. And culturally, why did and mindset wise, why did people get into that? Right. Because I guess if you want to prove your manliness, you could go into boxing back then or into classic sports, right? But the Taja Humara, for example, in Mexico, they've been doing that for centuries, I believe, right? Like culturally,
Mhm.
it's really like how you prove yourself as a man, but even as a woman, also like nowadays. So why did people choose that sport specifically? Like you and I, we know that we chose that sport, well, specifically on my side, because it gives me so many mindset points. It makes me a better human being, helps me endure in business, the pain, but also like in all facets of life. I think it's this is really the best sports to do that. It's the only sport that will take you to the deepest place in your pain cave, right? But back then, like they had options, or and they didn't want it to die. Nowadays we live in a life of luxury, right? Like we
Mhm.
have food, we have water. Back then they didn't. Why did they chose this crazy sport?
Yeah, I think that's one of those examples of necessity where if you look at the Rahamari tribe specifically, they like, they were essentially pushed off into the Copper Canyon. They were a little more populous and dispersed and to some degree probably less mobile, although I'm sure they were quite mobile even prior to that. But then, they sort of got pushed out of some of their, or consolidated maybe is a better way to look at it, into areas that were very harsh and seemingly like difficult to live in. So they got really good at running and using that as a vehicle of survival. And their populations did dwindle as a result of that, but they maintained um, likely a very robust portion of their community with that could survive in those sort of conditions and things like that. And um, it's interesting though, because like, although it was a huge component to their survival, just being able to, find food and be able to stay out of harm's way, essentially, it was something that they used leisurely to a degree too, where you'd see I'm blanking on the name of the game that they called it, but they played a game that kind of was revolved around a lot of just like kind of like endurance running essentially. So
Kicking
to
a
some
ball, I
degree,
think,
yeah,
while
yep,
running.
yep, exactly, yeah. So whether that was purely leisure or just also like a avenue to kind of like train the youth to sort of kind of get into the sport, as you kind of see today, where a lot of times the best development to be a professional runner isn't just to run from your very early youth, but to play a variety of different games and sports that include running. And then from a developmental standpoint, that often puts you in a better position to perform when you start to really focus in on a very like specific aspect of running, whether that be like Olympic distances or in my case, ultra marathon and things like that. So there could have been some ancient wisdom in just kind of the development side of things and how you kind of use games to kind of encourage the development. So when the younger generations are coming up and preparing themselves for adulthood, they'd have those tools available to them when it came time to actually go out in a consequential situation and have to be on their feet for hours and hours in an ultra marathon type setting.
Right. And I think hunting's the main one, right? Like it all started with hunting and outlasting these creatures. Is that true? Like, can we literally exhaust an animal to death? Literally, they stop running after like the 2 or 3 hour mark.
Yeah, that's what kind of makes humans physically unique is we're weaker and slower than most other animals. So what we can do though is we can move very slow for very, very long periods of time because we're very efficient with fluids. So, and cooling, I should say too, like topical cooling. People don't always understand. Like when you sweat, what's happening is that sweat is pooling on your skin and then it's evaporating, and the evaporation of that sweat's actually pulling the heat with it. So when you go out and run in the heat, you're able to run longer without overheating because of that evaporative cooling. Whereas if you're chasing like a gazelle or a deer or something like that, they can't do that. So they can sprint way faster than you, but then they have to stop and slow down. And eventually, if that continues, they're going to pass out from overheating. So what some of these subsistence hunting tribes would do historically would they would try to kind of separate part of the herd, and then that they in an ideal setting for them, there'd be a long like visual sight range, so there it was less likely that the prey would be out of sight and then potentially lose it. But they would just kind of continually creep up on it, and then it would run away, and then they would keep doing that and keep doing that. Eventually, it got to the point where it would be dehydrated or overheated, and then they could it would be theirs, and the hunt would be over. So yeah, and that would sometimes take hours and hours and hours to accomplish, but it was a skill set that kind of matched our humans, how humans kind of have evolved to be able to tolerate heat and process that sort of stuff. So it's an interesting aspect for sure.
Right. And the fact probably that we had very good memories, right? And we could map out the full field and bring them to a dangerous zone, right? It's like waiting for the creature to make a mistake, just like in the UFC or in boxing. It's
Yeah.
a strategic game, and you wait for the creature to fall under something, hit its foot on a rock badly, or spray its bars or whatever. I think there's also the mindset aspect of it, right? Like us humans, we can push further. We can sort of have a control over or fight or flight instinct, sort of control your cortisol, tell your brain that, hey, you're not going to die if you run for 2 hours, while the system is like, yeah, shit, you're dying. But your mind, it's controllable. It's like, yeah, I can go further. Was there also an aspect of that? Because most creatures, they do get into fight or flight or freeze, right? Like if they can't run, they just stop. Their system, they have a hard break, and us, we can sort of go over that. Do you think that's also a valid reason why we could outrun them?
Yeah, I think there's probably like a higher level problem solving aspect there, and then also just teamwork where, when like humans, probably one of their biggest strengths is we can cooperate very effectively with these sort of things, and we can cooperate in like a multi-step level versus just sort of reacting. So yeah, I think that plays to our advantage in a large way. Yeah, and then the kind of the control, and even almost in a reverse of what you said too, where some animals they sort of don't have a central governor to the degree where they can stop and pace properly so they can run themselves to death, which in certain circumstances you may not want to have that central governor there, because if it results in you like not getting where you need to get to, and the alternatives aren't great, then maybe you want to be able to override that at least temporarily. But for humans, like from a self-preservation standpoint, having kind of the ability to make it more difficult to say like, all right, I'm going to push myself to the brink of where I just fall over and die, is very difficult to do. So that's probably helpful in terms of just kind of knowing limitations as well, and then you can kind of test those, but knowing where they are a little more acutely is probably a valuable survival skill.
And back then, let's talk about equipment, right? Did we run with a spear next to us? Did we run with, yeah, sandals? Did we run naked like VS the modern runner, right? Like what equipment did we had that might have hurt us back then, or some shoes nowadays that are over cushion and are hurting or running posture?
Yeah, there's a lot of variety in that, I think, in terms of like tools that were used for both hunting and just survival in general, whether that be from like a weapon standpoint, like a spear, or like footwear. I mean, we were talking about the Rahamari earlier, and they had like sandals that they would make, which were essentially just like light protection from the ground, so from sharp objects more or less than anything. But in terms of like ground fuel and biomechanics, it was very much what you would like look at as like a minimalist shoe today. So, I mean, they were thinking about these things. I look at this a lot of times through the lens of like, we have a lot of tools, and we have to ask ourselves, how do these tools work to improve both performance, but then how do they also engage with our kind of our natural state in a way that could potentially be detrimental if we're not maintaining certain structural strengths. So like footwear is a great example of this, especially nowadays. Since about 2016, there've been a foam material in the sport of running that has sort of revolutionized how fast you can run. They sort of have this element where it reversed the race day shoe to a large degree, because it used to be how small of a shoe can I get away with on race day, because it's going to be firmer, more responsive, less weight, so more efficient. Now some of these foams are actually more efficient than that, so it becomes a game of how much cushion can you put on the shoe in order to gain more efficiency, to the degree where World Athletics has had to put rules in how much of that you can put in there, and they limit it at 40 millimeters, which is still an insane amount of cushion. So these shoes make you faster, but they also come at a cost of changing your mechanics. So they protect certain areas that otherwise would get worked, and they will put impact forces into other areas that maybe otherwise would not receive those impact forces. So there's no doubt a lot of additional injuries and issues that have come from that and will continue to come from that. So the way I usually look at it is like, if performance is the goal, the shoe foams that we have now are probably going to be necessary once you get to the kind of the top of the sport, because when we're talking about like the very top of a sport, we're talking about fractions of a percentage between first, second, and third place. And sometimes these products can be, upwards to a 3, 4, 5% efficiency gain. So you can't really give up that much and expect to compete. But that doesn't mean you have to be exposing yourself to that sort of varying mechanic all the time. So for me, what I like to do is I like to spend a good bit of time in kind of like natural footwear or barefoot or running in firm shoes that will allow for my foot to engage the way it would without a shoe there. But then I also will put on a pair of super shoes, premium foam shoes, enough so that I can get used to how that feels and how my body responds to that, so that on race day I can put those on and be able to um, still have a strong system from running in more natural products part of the time, but also leverage the performance benefits of the premium foams on race day when all those efficiencies count.
That's crazy. Yeah. I do the same. I think, yeah, I would buy like some of these here. I also train on lighter shoes, a bit heavier shoes. What brands do you recommend necessarily? Because I saw that you work at Alta. Nowadays it's Hoka, right? Like I'm using Speed Goats. I'm training for UTMB 110 in Brazil, Paraty nowadays.
Hmm.
So what kind of shoes would you recommend for that race specifically?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I was an athlete for Ultra for 11 years, and then I actually stepped away from them this year so I could explore the full shoe world. And just, it's the way I describe it is running shoes nowadays is a lot more like picking out a bike, where you want to have the right bike for the right distance, the right intensity, and the right course. And when you're trying to pick a variety of different races to do and things like that, it's good to have access to the entire market. So it makes exclusivity and brand partnerships that are like exclusive essentially very difficult to be able to do that. So um, I'm a better person to ask this question to now than I would have been a year ago, because I have better access to the entire market now. The way I look at it is, there are going to be some shoes that are going to typically perform better than others when it comes to just pure performance with the premium foam. So things to look for that is going to be some of these higher end shoe foams. Like Piba is one that gets a good reputation. That was Nike's Zoom X foam originally, or Nike's Zoom X used that type of foam originally and popularized it. So a foam like that oftentimes scores well on the efficiency charts. There is a lot of new innovation within that, where they have now these super critical foams, which may not be that Piba material, but it's like a nitrogen infused foam that kind of has a similar impact of improving efficiency. And they'll oftentimes blend these with a carbon plate, which will interact with that foam and your gait cycle in a way that sort of improves efficiency. So I'm usually looking for some of those premium foams, whether it be the Piba foams or the supercritical foams that are nitrogen infused, a plate. And then another thing I'll look at is, did they get it up to 40 millimeters at the heel? So like if you find one and it's, say it's 32 millimeters, it might be great foam, it might be a great carbon plate setup there, but they're probably missing out on some efficiencies by not getting it all the way up to that World Athletics regulation point of 40 millimeters. Um, the final piece of the puzzle is the weight. So the shoes that have really nailed this have managed to get the 40 millimeters of uh, high efficiency super shoe premium foam, the carbon plate, and then they got the weight down as light as you can get away with that much material there. And right now, like that's been kind of marked at around the 6 ounce range is typically a pretty good target. You get some that have gotten a little less than that and some a little bit more that still perform quite well. So that usually puts us in a world where a lot of the top tier shoes out there right now are some of Nike's top tier performance super shoes. Puma's got a new one right now that I think is like top of the line in the market. It's called the Fast R Nitro Elite 3. Adidas Evo series is really good. That's one scored high efficient size. Asics Metaspeed, another one that scored really well recently. There's others out there too. Those are just ones that tend to kind of show up quite often when people kind of dig through all right, which shoes are performing well right now and which shoes are the top athletes in the world using. Which is another thing you can use too if you want to know about a specific brand and how the shoe probably performs. Go dig up their pro athletes and see what shoes they're wearing. Sometimes they're wearing a prototype, which isn't available to everyone yet, but there's usually a prior model of that that's probably in the same ballpark. Or you can look back what they were using the year prior, and that might tell you what's on the market at the moment that was at the time a prototype, and kind of go with that. So the other thing to consider with that too is pace or intensity is going to be impactful here. So the faster you go, the more you're probably going to get out of these shoes. So where I see this kind of starting to maybe separate to some degree would be if I'm going to go out and race like a marathon or even 100 miles. Like if you take my fastest 100 mile, I ran 6:47 for that. So if I were to do that again with super shoes, I would be getting a pretty good advantage from that because that pace and that intensity is going to respond quite well to that technology. Whereas if I would go and say, okay, I'm going to do a 6-day event or even a 2-day or 48-hour event where the pace comes way down and it's more about moving consistently at a very, very low pace, managing breaks effectively, and just making sure that you're consistently putting one foot in the front of the other. And like a world-class pace for something like that might be between 10 and 15 minutes per mile. The super shoes aren't probably going to be something that's going to be a huge value add there, because one way that they get those to be so fast is they compromise on stability. And stability gets increasingly more important the longer you're going, because you are engaging your lower legs in a way that's going to fatigue if you're on an unstable platform. And 6 days on an unstable platform is you're going to hit failure points of your feet and lower legs very, very early with a product like that. So you might be better off with a shoe that technically doesn't perform as fast on traditional endurance cycle or endurance frameworks, but on an event like that, where you're moving a little bit slower, closer to kind of like a fast, brisk walking pace, then you're probably better off just finding whatever's most comfortable on your foot in that scenario, and produce or gives you enough stability so your lower legs stay as fresh as possible.
Your 647 base, what's the mindset needed to accomplish that? And what's the preparation? Like, give me an idea of how drastically different it is from a slower 10 minutes plus pace.
Yeah, for that race specifically, I spent a lot of time running a similar pace to that. Like I was doing 100+ mile weeks consistently for the months leading in, and then when I peaked, I had some weeks where I was hitting 150 miles that oftentimes included like 3.5 hour long runs on a track where I would run like actually slightly faster than that usually. And what that did for me is it just allowed me to kind of carry over a well-rounded endurance fitness protocol that had like a bunch of different intensities included in it, and sort of leverage like a peaking phase where I spent like 6 to 8 weeks really focusing on the pace I was actually going to run, and be just really efficient and comfortable doing that. So then when it came to running 100 of those in a row, it didn't feel like it was something that was super unsustainable. And I mean, I had my struggles that day for sure, and doubts and all that stuff, but I was very confident that the pace was sustainable and the training would have me where I was at. So when I got to those hard points, I was able to better probably navigate it mentally, because I had faith in what I had done, and I was very aware of the training that I had done. I'd probably done a better job before that race than any other of just taking inventory of how much work I actually did, and then leveraged that to minimize how much running was actually going to be done that day comparatively. In terms of slowing down and going closer to like a 10, you know, it's funny. It's like running a 10-minute mile pace for me is almost feels a little more awkward because it's just not a pace I do a lot. So mechanically, my body's not very familiar to it. So for a scenario like that, I'd probably be more likely to do sort of a run walk strategy where I'm oftentimes when running going faster than that, but then I'm taking breaks and walking and going slower in that. So I'm averaging out to that. So if I were to do, say, like a 48-hour event, I haven't done anything longer than 24 hours yet. So this is all just theorizing at this point. But I would probably do it in a manner where when I was running, I'd be trying to run like somewhere between like 8 to 9 minute mile pace because I can feel fairly comfortable and like I could go forever almost at that pace. It feels a lot easier than 647s, but it's also just a little more boring because it doesn't stimulate your mind the same way. Um, and then I would probably slow down and do some walking breaks. Maybe I would use those to focus on fueling and hydration and that aspect of things, just so I'm not getting too far ahead of what would be a realistic goal target. Because I think that's one of the easiest mistakes to make in these longer ultras is a pace that's too fast in the beginning is still going to feel very, very, very easy versus like a 5K. If you're going too fast at the beginning of the 5K, it's kind of obvious because you're getting pretty close to the high end of your aerobic intensity spectrum, and that's a very specific sensation that you kind of are more cautious around. Whereas, if your easy run is a little too fast for goal race pace, then it's still going to feel very easy early on until it doesn't. and then it's too late. So you sort of have to do some strategizing around that and not necessarily trust how easy something feels in the moment in the early stages of a really long race like that.
Right. And I think your record when you were younger was like 28 minutes, the 5K, which is pretty good. Tell me a bit more about how you got into racing as a younger guy. You mentioned earlier that, yeah, if you practice multi-sports instead of just cross-country running, for example, Fred Hines, I think, is a good example of that. Like he probably overdid running when he was younger. He lost his passion, but nowadays he repicked it up, VS like a kid that have started playing multi-sport and just discovered running like fresh at 18 or something like that. I think they're gonna
Hmm.
have a better career and they're gonna hit PRs faster. Although Truett is making like incredible records right now. Tell me about how you got into ultra running yourself and how you could scale it and do all these records as an adult.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I think like for me personally, I felt almost as if I was trying to catch up with my peers when it came to running development up until essentially I started doing ultra marathon running. And part of that was just, when I was in middle school and high school, I was very interested in other sports too. I didn't really take running seriously or putting it on this like, this is my favorite sport, this is my priority until, maybe my junior, senior year of high school. So by the time I finished high school and started really getting interested in running and went to college, a lot of my peers had already started training year round quite a bit sooner than I had and had been running maybe twice as much as I was on it, just a volume standpoint. So for me, it was kind of like my college experience felt more like, all right, I got a lot of learning to do and I need to kind of start this process if I want to make this or even just discover if it was something I wanted to continue to do after college. Because at that time in my life, I didn't have any ambitions of becoming a professional athlete. I didn't have what I would consider like the pedigree to target that sort of thing. So I, went from an academic standpoint, focused on other things and did track and cross country as sort of a hobby or something that I was interested in. And since the program was available to me at the school I went to, it was like, why not? Right. So it was very much a learning experience, kind of figuring out why you do certain workouts, what parts of the sport I really liked. Was it something I wanted to carry over into life after college when I started my teaching career at the time? And what I learned from that was the answer was yes. And I also learned that I really did like the long running aspect, building high mileage weeks. The long run was always my favorite run of the week when we would do our varying workouts during cross country and track season and things like that. So after college, I started just kind of building more foundational volume and not doing a whole lot of speed work for a while. And that sort of led me into experiencing my first ultra marathon in 2010, a 50 miler called the North Face Midwest Regional Championship 50 mile in Wisconsin. And that sort of got me really interested in the sport and wanting to do ultra marathons versus focusing on more traditional endurance events. So by the end of 2011, I was basically all in. I did 350 milers that fall. And I knew going into 2012 that I was going to start focusing on ultra marathons kind of more exclusively and not necessarily try to peak in things like 5Ks, 10Ks, and marathons.
Right. And how does making a world record feels like? Is it incredibly painful? And then once you achieve it, is it like hedonic treadmill? Like, where's the next record?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say like I've had more what I would call painful or difficult races that didn't yield world records. And I think it's part of it is like when you run a world record, things just have to go right. Like you have to have paced yourself properly. You'd have to have nailed hydration and nutrition, and your mindset has to be on point. So it is difficult. There are doubts, there are like hard mental struggles. It does feel physically difficult, but it feels like those are coming at you while you're gaining momentum, which is a very positive mental space to be in, versus a scenario where maybe you make some mistakes and you get to, say, mile 80 of the 100 mile, and you're just holding on for dear life to try to preserve what you built towards that point versus kind of powering through towards it. Those races are by far the more difficult, in my opinion. When I ran 11:19 and broke the world record for 100 miles and 104.88 miles for 12 hours, like that race actually felt much better than my prior fastest time, where I went 11 hours and 40 minutes for 100 miles and didn't even go the next 20 minutes to get to the 12-hour mark because I was too exhausted. Because at that particular race, I had got out a little too fast for what I was ready for. I still think I was on I think I was in world record shape that day, but I just didn't manage my pacing quite right. And by the time I got to 80 miles, I needed to average roughly like 7 minute mile pace to break the then world record. And I had a hard time maintaining anything faster than a 7:30. So I really struggled to run 7:30s for that last 20 miles. And it took everything out of me just to get to that finish line for that one. So that one stands out to me as more difficult, even though I ran, 21 minutes slower that day. So a lot of it, I think, has to do with just the right strategy and the right mindset and the right nutrition, the right everything, kind of putting you in a position where when it's time to really focus and put in the hard work, you've put yourself in a good position to be receptive to it and energized to go after it versus feeling like you're trying to just hold on, if that sort of makes sense.
A lot, yes. I want to finish off with talking about your coaching, right? Like, I have a difficult time getting coaches because I'm more than an ultra athlete. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a husband. I do like a whole bunch of things, right? And always
Mhm.
fitting like a specific schedule, specific nutrition is very hard in my schedule. Let's say my nutrition, I don't only eat to run ultras, right? I also eat to enjoy myself and have fun. That might mean sourdough bread, like
Yeah.
including that in my diet. And yeah, my schedule's pretty insane. I have probably like 10 to 15 meetings per day. So how would you recommend coaching for a guy like me that's preparing for 110K and Ultra Parati Brazil? Let's say that I would hire you. How could we make this fit with my current schedule?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is one thing I love about the coaching aspect, because a lot of people, I think, they look at ultra marathoning, they just look at like the vastness of distance, essentially, when you look at some of the distance of these races, and they just assume this is going to be something that they have to dedicate a tremendous amount of time to. And there's a path forward there. Like you can train 20 plus hours a week if you want, and to some degree, if you have that time and you have the development to do that, then it can yield a good result. But that's not the only way to get to the finish line. So there's kind of a couple things that I like to talk to people in the early stages to get on the same page as to like how to best meet their needs. And one of those is like, let's just look at your schedule and come up with an amount of time per week and even more granularly, like what days, what blocks of time do you have available to train? And let's say we get to a spot and there is 8 to 10 hours per week available to train. Then I say, okay, as your coach, I'm going to take that 8 to 10 hours that you can afford to dedicate to this project, and I'm going to make you the best ultra runner you can be within the best framework that fits into that, versus trying to say, well, this person ran 15 hours a week and got that result. Therefore, you have to dedicate 15 hours a week, because I can always find someone who did their best at less or did their best at more. So to me, it's more about fitting it into what else you have going on and then picking the plan that is going to work best within that framework for most people. Because most of the people I coach aren't professional athletes. They're mostly people like you just described. They have a business, they have a career, they have a family, they've got all sorts of other competing interests. So um, we can kind of layer that out even further too, because sometimes it's like this might be a 6 month goal where maybe we're a little more flexible with how we structure things in those first 4 months, in terms of like, okay, we're not going to go out beyond like this time frame and this schedule, so we don't create undue stress in other areas of your life because we're trying to run this ultra marathon. But maybe we pick a few weekends at the back end, we get closer to the race, where you can dedicate a little more time than we normally would. So maybe instead of 8 to 10 hours on 4 weeks near the end, you're able to give me 14 or 15, so I can have you do some very like race specific stuff on a couple of days. So it's not like this big like half year or permanent sacrifice where now you have to like manage this big training volume structure for the rest of your life and then have that compete with your other passions and needs and things like that. But rather, let's find something that fits with the framework of your life, work on consistency with that, with the best plan available for that type of structure. And then if possible, we get closer to the race. If we can block off a little bit of extra time just to kind of temporarily make some sacrifices to give you yourself a few more tools on race day, awesome. We're going to take advantage of that if we can. Um, so I think it ends up being like it can be done a lot less stressful and a lot less involved than I think a lot of people think sometimes. And I think the sport's grown on this too. We're seeing a lot more people come to the sport with that mindset of, hey, I think I can do this, versus this mindset of, I'm not even going to bother because running that far is going to necessitate a level of training and discipline that I don't have the availability for.
Love that. Well, Zach, thanks so much for coming on today. Where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Charles. It's been fun to chat about ultra marathons. The best spot to find everything I do is at my website, which is just zachbitter.com. There you can find my podcast, social media channels, coaching services, and all that sort of stuff. I'm probably most active on Instagram for social media, which is just at Zach Bitter.
That was Zach Bitter and Charles Cormier for another